Both sides of the prison system, corrections officers and advocates representing the prisoners themselves, are pressing their case for change at a fever pitch these days. CEOs say they're unsafe after 30 staff in Malone got sent to the hospital due to an unknown substance. And they say they're short-staffed, and that's dangerous. Inmate advocates say the whole system is riddled with violence. The biggest example, the fatal beating of Robert Brooks by corrections officers. That case is about to go before a grand jury. We're going to take a step back today, though, and look at prison systems as a whole and how they can make the situation more dangerous for everyone. That's today's story of the day.
Support for Story of the Day comes from Morja Wealth Management, serving the North Country for 3 generations. MorjaWM.com. Securities offered through Hightower Securities, LLC, member FINRA, SIPC. Hightower is an SEC-registered investment advisor. And Kinney Drugs, now offering specialized home medical equipment and supplies. Learn more at KinneyHomeCare.com.
Hey, I'm David Summerstein. It's Tuesday, February 11th. First up. The head of New York's public university system makes more than $1 million a year. That figure got lawmakers' attention in Albany, and now they're pushing for more pay regulations. Jung-Yoon Han reports from the New York Public News Network.
To put this into perspective, the governor makes $250,000. John King, SUNY's chancellor, receives nearly 4 times that amount, plus a monthly housing allowance of $15,000. Capital Region Republican Jake Ashby says that's frustrating for his constituents.
They look at that and they're kind of scratching their head, thinking, is this a joke?
Ashby is introducing a bill that would require the Senate to sign off on any salaries for heads of state agencies or commissions if they're higher than the governor's salary. Ashby is also introducing another law that would require SUNY chancellors to live in the state, which he says would make a housing allowance unnecessary.
What we're looking at in terms of these bills is just more oversight in general.
Hudson Valley Democrat James Skoufis wants to take things a step further. The senator says the chancellor's salary should not be more than the governor's.
This is just patently elitist. It is out of touch. And it's incumbent upon the legislature to now do something about it.
Skoufis is proposing a pay cut for King in the state budget and is reintroducing a bill he wrote in 2023. If it passes, salaries for top leaders in the SUNY and CUNY systems would have to get the green light from both legislative chambers and the Division of Budget. Representatives from SUNY have defended the pay raise in the past. They say the chancellor's salary is similar to that for other leaders at other public university systems across the country. In Albany, I'm Jung-Yoon Han for the New York Public News Network.
A new report about prisons around the U.S. reveals how disciplinary systems can further harm inmates and make facilities less safe for everyone. Emily Russell spoke with Brian Nam Sonnenstein from the Prison Policy Initiative, a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization that just published the report on disciplinary systems behind bars.
We surveyed close to 50 incarcerated people for this report to just ask them questions like, what charges do you see enforced the most? What charges do you see enforced the least? What is your experience with the disciplinary process? And I think most of them, if I had to distill it, is that this is essentially a way to enforce sort of like a petty, arbitrary form of power over a powerless population. That a lot of what happens in terms of how these policies are carried out comes down to the individual and even daily whims of particular corrections officers. And the same goes in the other direction. Like if you're successful in fighting your disciplinary charge, often that involves just having the luck of getting the right corrections officer to intervene on your behalf. And I think all of this has the effect on incarcerated people of, it discourages them from wanting to engage in their own rehabilitation. And that's not even just like the ways that it actually obstructs people. It just kind of removes the hope that people have of becoming better or believing that they're in a place where that's even possible, because they're just constantly sort of nitpicked and like anything that they do can be used against them or constructed out of whole cloth to get them into trouble.
So I obtained the disciplinary records of one inmate here in northern New York, and for just one incident, he was charged with creating a disturbance, interference, violating a direct order, and a movement violation. So how does that reflect a kind of strategy of, taking multiple charges against an inmate?
Yeah, so the idea here, according to the incarcerated people we spoke with, is that they are going to layer as many of the most plausible charges on a misconduct report with the hopes that something is going to stick, right? So the hearing officer might be like, well, I don't know about disrupting the orderly operation of the institution, but they did disobey an order. And then on the other side of it, there's this idea that like, if you're facing all of these charges, you should just plead guilty and maybe they'll reduce the charges, or, maybe you'll get some sort of leniency in the sanction for admission of guilt. So yeah, it's both this idea of just trying to get something to stick, but also coercing the person into just foregoing sort of the hearing process altogether and pleading guilty to the charges.
I'd like to talk about solitary confinement. It's something that I've heard incarcerated people talk about, or their family members say that their loved one has gone through that. In your report, you described that as torture. And so I wonder, if you can kind of talk us through that and how often it's used as a form of punishment in prison.
We know that solitary confinement, there's been ample research, over the past few decades, and in particular in the last decade, about solitary confinement's impact on people's physical and mental well-being. In terms of their physical well-being, the restriction to your cell, the inability to move, those things can have grave consequences for a person's physical well-being. People develop all kinds of physical ailments from being deprived of sunlight and oxygen and essentially being locked in a box the size of a closet. In terms of the sort of mental anguish of solitary confinement, there's research pointing to its effect on people's literal brain structure. It exacerbates mental illness. And part of the way that this happens, not just through the actual literal isolation of a person in a cell, is that they incur basically all of the other sanctions that we talk about in the report. So you lose your access to programming, you lose your access to your ability to visit or take phone calls, or in some cases your mail is really limited. And this can all have severe psychological impacts on people, even in just a short amount of time. I've written in the past about how even brief periods of solitary confinement seem to indicate an increased likelihood of death after a person is released from prison. So these are long-term, very intense harms that come from solitary confinement.
I hear this argument often that incarcerated people are in prison for a reason. They've been found guilty of committing a crime, so they deserve any and all punishment that they receive, and they don't deserve due process in these disciplinary hearings. I wonder just what your response is to that.
There are a lot of ways in which prisons sort of manufacture this image through their own processes and through their own orientation to incarcerated people. This sort of level of distrust and this stigmatization feeds into a treatment of incarcerated people that sort of reproduces this image of them as rule breaking and unruly and violent. And the effect of all of this is that our prison populations remain enormous and long-standing, and we have these incredibly long sentences that are not really paralleled anywhere else in the world. And I think just, aside from the practical issues, this is just a tremendous injustice. No matter what you've done, subjecting people to such an arbitrary process like this, these are both unjust and, again, they do nothing to make us safer. In fact, they make us much less safe.
That was Brian Nam Sonnenstein from the Prison Policy Initiative, speaking with Emily Russell about his latest report on disciplinary systems. We reached out to New York's Department of Corrections for comment on its use of solitary confinement as a form of punishment, and we haven't heard back. We have more news all the time on our website, ncpr.org. Music today by Mark Corey of Watertown and Patricia Julian of Burlington. I'm David Summerstein, North Country Public Radio.